Hello, and welcome to another day of English 2. I am your online instructor, Miss Bear. As a reminder, we have been working on a personal narrative unit from Common Lit, and the title of that unit in Common Lit is Coming of Age. Our essential question for the entire unit is what experiences lead us from childhood into adulthood. And before we get to the end of the unit, we are going to complete a mid-unit task, which is a personal narrative. In this personal narrative, you are going to describe an experience that has been part of your transition out of childhood. And when you're deciding on a moment to write about, you need to consider one or all of the following: a loss that you experienced, a realization or difficult truth that you learned, a new responsibility that you had to take on, and or a risk that you decide to take. And so when we are working on this, we need to be looking at what our standard says that we need to do. So we're going to look at that standard, but before we do, I want to remind you of the texts that we have read, because we're going to use these texts as mentor sections for each part of the narrative expectation. So we read first, safety of numbers. So if you have that, make sure you pull that out. We also read growing up key moments. Pull that text out if you have it, and you should have it. Hopefully your teacher will have some extra copies if you don't have yours. We also read through the tunnel. And lastly, just yesterday, we read John F. Kennedy inspired us then and now. We're going to be using these texts to help us understand what our standards mean and what they expect us to do. So look at this standard. Standard 10.3 says, and this is for writing, it starts with a W, so it means writing. Write narratives to develop real or imagined experiences or events using effective technique, well-chosen details, and well-structured event sequences. Every single text that we have read has done that. Specifically, you have subsections of this standard. In A, it says it's supposed to be engage and orient the reader by setting out a problem, situation, or observation, establishing one or multiple points of view, and introducing a narrator and or characters, create a smooth progression of experiences or events. Use narrative techniques such as dialogue, pacing, description, reflection, and multiple plot lines to develop experiences, events, and or characters. It also requires that you use a variety of techniques to sequence events so that they build on one another to create a coherent whole. Use precise words and phrases, telling details, and sensory language to convey a vivid picture of the experiences, events, setting, and or characters. And lastly, provide a conclusion that follows from and reflects on what is experienced, observed, or resolved over the course of the narrative. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at each one of those subsections as it is reflected in the stories that we've already written, in those texts that we've already read. Sorry, we haven't written anything yet. Those texts that we've already read. Some of those texts are nonfiction and some of them are fiction. And so when you are deciding to write, you can choose one piece of your life that nobody knows you that well. They don't know all the truth. And Faulkner always says to start with a nugget of truth and then expand. So you can always expand that truth to include some fictionalized details so that you can create this effective text. So let's start with subsection A. And this is a snippet that I pulled from Safety of Numbers. And it says to engage and orient the reader by setting out a problem, situation, or observation. I'm not going to read all of that again. You have that on your screen. But let's look at how Amy Tan set out a problem. When my friend Bobby Klein didn't make it into the gifted program back in 5th grade, Mom said, "Why so hard about IQ? There's nothing you can't study for." She's right in my case. So you see, and I want you to continue reading just that little excerpt, and so you can see that Amy Tan reaches this standard and then some. So I want you to think about how she engaged the reader and how she set that problem out, so when you're reading, you're not bored by the details. You're not going, on December the 8th, 1995, I was born. Is that really engaging? Is that going to grasp your reader's attention? Probably not, unless you have something else that significant that happened that you can make it sound so much grander than it was. This is engaging to you, or I hope it's engaging to you, because it's a problem that you face. And when you are writing about a personal narrative, especially an idea that you grew from, that you took this event that happened in your life and you have grown from it, every single one of your classmates has experienced something similar. And so that should engage your reader. They don't need to know when your birth date was. They want an event that happened, and you want to immediately engage them with that. And that's what Amy Tan has done here. Let's look at that next subsection. Use narrative techniques such as dialogue, pacing, description, reflection, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to read that again. So again, Amy Tan, from lines 34 on, you can see right here she has one of the cops standing in our living room is Bobby Kline's dad. Well, you know what? She talked about Bobby Kline in her introduction. So she's bringing that character back in, and she's making sure that you as the reader make some connections. But you see, ma'am, he says, putting a hand on mom's shoulder, nothing is missing. So you have Bobby Kline's dad, the police officer, having a conversation with the mom of this story. And you see, it's not, you've got one long section of description, and then it's broken up with this conversation that happens, and then you go back down here and you see she goes back to her original idea of taking these tests and having these exams. And you see you have these multiple plot lines, you've got a lot of description, and you've got dialogue, you've got pacing. Pacing means that your story follows a flow, that you don't jump a lot without at least giving some details or saying something in there of, for the next several days, nothing really happened, but then, and then something major happened. So if you're going to jump a lot in time, then you want to explain to your reader very briefly that that period of time, nothing really happened exciting, and you're skipping over it. And that's okay to do, to pace your story effectively. Because if it's boring, if it's boring to you, it's going to be boring to your reader. So make sure that any of those minor details that don't even matter aren't put into your story. Okay? The next section says to use a variety of techniques to sequence events so that they build on one another to create a coherent whole. And so here we have growing up key moments, and you see these authors, or this author, used a technique different than any of the other stories that we read. And this author uses headings. And so the truth about Santa and big news. So you can use headings in your personal narrative, just like this young lady did in Growing Up Key Moments. So you need to think about what's going to work best for the story that you're going to tell. So think about that and how that will flow and how you can use different techniques. So if we go back to this Amy Tan, this section, you see the variety of techniques. You see that you've got a big section of description, and then you go into dialogue, and then you go back to a section of description. That is using a variety of techniques throughout the story that you're telling. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second, and I'm going to say, if you write a 3-paragraph personal narrative, that's really not enough space to really give your reader a good story. So just because you want to use one or two little events and you don't give enough descriptive detail, you're not going to do the first part, which is engage and orient your reader. So make sure that you've got plenty of details that you can talk about. All right, next in our sequence of standards, you've got to use precise words and phrases. So this is a section from Through the Tunnel, and I want you to notice over here it says, he pulled himself along with his hands, fast, and used his legs as levers. Now, when you think about the word lever, you think about maybe a game console that you're using a lever to go back and forth, or a joystick. I'm not even sure what they call those these days, but levers look different. You don't think about your feet being levers, but he was using his feet as levers. So very precise, specific language. It says he was continuously pressed against the sharp roof, which felt slimy as well as sharp. Again, those precise details. You can picture that cave. He gave himself a panicky, convulsive kick forward, ducked his head, and swam. I know that you have seen someone who has convulsed. And if you haven't, look it up on Google, because it's scary, but it's also funny to watch. And I don't mean that negatively. I don't want you to think that I'm some terrible person who's going to laugh at someone convulsing. But afterwards, if the person is okay, it can be a funny event. I think about a time when I was young and I was underwater and my lungs started just screaming at me, and I could feel myself convulsing. I had to get rid of the air that was in my lungs, and I was underwater. And so I can look back now and I can laugh about what I must have looked like at that moment. It is a very precise detail. So you want to think about those moments, and you want to think about how you can describe those events so that you give your reader a beautiful picture and they can see what you're writing. And I know you're like, they can see it, I'm not drawing it. Yes, you want enough details where they can see what you're talking about. Lastly, you want to provide a conclusion that follows from and reflects on what's been experienced, observed, or resolved over the course of the narrative. And in this slide, I have provided the conclusions for every single text that we've read, and even some from the very short letters that were written to the editors. So I want you to see that each one of these endings follows the same form that the original text has been following the whole time. You don't want to say, and that's the end. No, you want to follow the same language that you've used the entire time. You want to follow the same techniques that you've done the entire time. You don't have to say that you learned a lesson. You can, but you don't have to. You want to almost leave your reader wanting to know more about what happened, but not so much that they're confused about what happened or the lesson that you learned. Now, I've given you a lot for today, and the next time that we meet, we're going to do a peer review. So I'm calling this the end of day 12, and we're going to start again on day 13, but my day 13 may be your day 14, because you may need an entire day or longer to write. That's going to be up to the teacher in your classroom. But for now, you have all of the tools that you need to write your personal narrative. So I can't wait for your teachers to send those in to me, and I get to read about all of the cool things that have happened in your life. And until next time, happy reading and happy writing.